Welcome to this short presentation on the question of what is happening to extreme poverty. In 2000, 8 Millennium Development Goals were set by the United Nations and other agencies with the aim to improve the living conditions in the world's poorest countries. We are going to focus on Millennium Development Goal 1, which is about reducing poverty and hunger. One of its targets is to halve, between 1990 and 2015, the proportion of people whose income is less than $1.25 a day. To track progress towards this goal, the United Nations relies on the World Bank definition of an international poverty line. They consider that a person is extremely poor if their income or consumption expenditures is below $1.25 per day. Now, $1.25 buys a lot more in India than it does in the US, but this is not how it's calculated. It's been adjusted to purchasing power, and that's what PPP means, purchasing power parities. These were last calculated in 2005. So, for example, take two countries, the US and India. Based on the normal currency exchange rates, $1.25 in 2005 was equal to about 55 rupees. But because the cost of living is lower in India, the equivalent in India of the purchasing power of $1.25 in the US is really lower. So when adjusted to PPP, $1.25 was approximately 19 rupees. And this is how equivalent poverty lines were calculated around the world in 2005. Then, to calculate the value of the poverty line for 1990 and other years, the World Bank uses so-called consumer price indexes, or CPIs. Simply put, this accounts for inflation. Countries can then track over the years, through surveys, how many people live under that line. Now that we understand the method, let's see what has been happening to extreme poverty. Here are three different versions of the story. In this first version, you can see here in the graph the drop in the percentage of people in the developing world living in extreme poverty. It went down from 43% in 1990 to about 22% in 2010. And recently, in July 2012, the United Nations reported that the number of people living in extreme poverty has been reduced by half, well ahead of schedule. So you can see here the Millennium Development Goal for 2015, and we've actually already reached that goal in 2010 according to these calculations. Now here's a second version of the story. As you can see here from the graph, extreme poverty, in billion people living on less than $1 or on less than $2 a day, has remained quite steady over the years. And actually, if you exclude China from these calculations, the number of extreme poor in the world has been trending upward since 1990. Here's a third version of the story. Some argue that extreme poverty may actually be on the rise. $1.25 is really very low. How can someone in the US survive on that? If you take a slightly more realistic marker of $2.50 a day, then, according to the World Bank's own data, there has been a slight increase in extreme poverty between 1990 and 2005, and not a drop. With this new poverty line, we're actually not ahead, but behind schedule towards reaching the Millennium Development Goal. With an even more reasonable poverty line of $8, $9, or $10 a day, the numbers look a lot worse. Now coming back to that first version that says that extreme poverty has been halved, there are several methodological limitations and uncertainties. The issue of food is one of them. An average individual in the US may spend somewhere between 10 and 30% on food and basic necessities, which means they have a larger proportion left to spend on other things: health, education, leisure. In comparison, a poor person in India may spend, say, 70 to 90% of their budget on food, which means very little remains to spend on anything else. The use of purchasing power parities and consumer price indexes does not account for this difference in patterns of consumption. More specifically, these calculations do not assign sufficient weight to food prices in the consumption expenditures of the poor. Since 2005, when the PPPs were last calculated, food prices have gone up faster than CPI, than the Consumer Price Index. And this means that the purchasing power of the lower incomes is weaker than what the World Bank calculations suggest, because most of it is spent on food. It also implies that the reported drop in extreme poverty has been overestimated. And this actually helps to explain the increase in levels of undernourishment in the world, as was reported recently by the Food and Agriculture Organization. This issue is just one of the many complexities that are not taken into account in the World Bank calculations. Now, what are the take-home messages? Well, as we've seen, there are conflicting poverty measurements. What is happening to extreme poverty? Is it dropping? Is it persisting? Is it rising? Well, the first version that says that extreme poverty is dropping is based on a lot of uncertainty, both in the statistical method and in the underlying data. So here's the question to think about. When the World Bank and the United Nations state that we've halved extreme poverty, is it their cause to be more cautious? We also need to seriously question how appropriate it is to use such a simple quantitative measure as the $25 for something as complex and multifaceted as extreme poverty. Thank you.